Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to today's Partner Web Conference. This is Fast Track Dynamics 365 for Finance and Operations Tech Talk. Today's topic, Regression Suite Automation Tool, Testing Lifecycle Demo. My name is Janice and I'm going to be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events and the audio can be heard through your PC speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. If you do not consent to be a part of a recorded session, we ask that you please disconnect now. Attendees may access the web conference recording within 72 hours via the same registration link that was used to attend today's live broadcast. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, you can turn on the Q&A panel by selecting the question mark icon located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. We do have presenters standing by to answer your questions throughout the session. Now, on to the show. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Senior Solutions Architect Mark Dedeher, and joining Mark on Q&A is Senior Solutions Architect Archana Prasad. So without any further delay, Mark, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Hey, welcome everybody in this second part of the Tech Talk regarding automated regression testing. In the first part, we have been talking a little bit about the environment setup. So we explained that we have Lifecycle services being connected to our Azure DevOps, and we have a Dynamics Finance and Operations environment, which we're going to use for the task recording and saving our BPM, saving our recordings to the BPM. BPM will then generate test cases in our Azure DevOps project. And as last step, we're going to, we have been setting up the Regression Suite automation tool software on our test client. Important to know for that the supported environments that we do have for Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. So we can use the Tier 1 development and demo environments, and we can use them as well in cloud hosted or the ones which are on the Microsoft managed subscription. Of course, when we do the recordings and also if we want to playback, we can connect to the Tier 2, the standard acceptance test, or the higher machines, the performance add-ons. But there are some limitations on that, so it will only work for the Tier 2 plus environments which have been deployed with classic VMs. We do know that for the new deployments that we're using Service Fabric, and we're working on that for making sure that we will be able for doing a playback on those machines as well. But at this moment, you can only do the recording, but we're not able for doing the playbacks. And similar for the on-premises, this is both on our roadmap. Regarding supported environments for our test client, there we can use basically any Windows 10 PC. Might be your laptop, might also be a virtual machine. And probably if you think about regularly execution of your test suites, probably you should not take a personal laptop, but you should search for a dedicated VM. That can be then in Windows 10, but can also be a Windows Server. For test purposes, you could also install the Regression Suite automation tool on your Tier 1 environment and then connecting to the same environment. That's possible if you do have admin rights on the Tier 1. So this would be only limited then for the cloud-hosted environments. For more details, I'm going to refer to the session we have been doing earlier, and there's a lot of more details in that session. For today, I'm going to focus much more on the life cycle of the testing. And basically, I've set it up in 4 steps. I think the first step is you need to define your test scenario. Once you have a defined test scenario, it might be broken in different test cases. We're going to need to record them, and that's my second step. And then once we have done the recordings, then typically we would prepare a test scenario that includes all those recordings. And of course, the last step in the life cycle is that we would be playing on a regular timings. We would execute the test scenarios against our environments. So let's look a little bit into the first one. Step one, define a test scenario. So basically what we need to do is we need to have somewhere a test where we can predict what will be the outcome, and we must be able to repetitive playing it back and making sure that every time we can be verifying that the scenario is still running as expected. Typically, the person who is doing that should be a solution architect. Sometimes in the larger implementations, there will be a dedicated test manager, but it is somebody who needs to have an overview. And typically, those test scenarios might span different areas. So it's somebody who has a little bit a holistic view about the solution. And typically those test scenarios, you start defining them during your analysis and your design phase. So it should actually be an integral part of your implementation. Why do we have to do that? Well, first of all, we could just do any recording, but if we cannot predict what is the outcome, and if we cannot automate the outcome and automate the verification of the outcome, then of course it would be very difficult afterwards, after we have been running our test scenario, to verify if something is now correct or not, because it's not because it didn't throw any error that the outcome of the calculations and so are still valid. So typically a test scenario is a little bit more complex than just doing a simple task recording. We need to think upfront a little bit of what are we trying to do, what will be the outcome, and how can I make sure that I validate the outcome as well as part of my test scenario. For this demo, I have created a very simple test scenario. So imagine that we have a scenario where we're going to create a production order. Then the production order has been created. Typically, the production planner would estimate. Then the production order would be scheduled and would be released. That's typically all activities that are done by the production planner. And then typically what would happen is once a production order is released, the manufacturing department would be picking that up, and a machine operator would start the production order. In a typically scenario, he would do a lot of registrations on a production order, what kind of material has been consumed, how long operations has been running. I've stripped it all out, so for this demo, I'm just going to start the production order, and I'm going to report as finished immediately after. But basically what I wanted to highlight here is that simple scenario is already spawning two different roles. So I have the production planner and I have the machine operator. And for making sure that I can afterwards will be able to run my different recordings with the correct security role, I'm going to split the records per role. So I will have a task recording for the production planner that I can play back, and I'm going to make a task recorder for the machine operator that I can play back. So typically, as best practice, I would split my recordings each time we're crossing a different role. Or also, if there are some things that we have to wait for instance, a specific job can only be run after a batch job has been executed, then typically we need to split. And we need to make sure that we put a wait time between the two task recordings so that the batch jobs have the time for kicking in and executing whatever needs to be done. Also here important, because now I have been splitting my task recordings of my scenario in two task recordings, I will need to have a possibility for passing information from my first recording to my second recording. In this simple example, each time I'm creating a new production order, my number sequence will generate a new number, and that new number, I need to pass it to the second recording so that my machine operator can do a filter on that newly created production order, and that of course he starts the right order, and also that he then do the report as finished on the right order. As mentioned before, this would typically be what you would be doing a task recording if you would build it for a guide, as a task guide as information. But to make it a good test scenario, I need to add some validations. And in this simple example, I'm just going to add 2 validations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to request the on-hand quantity for my item before I start my production. Then I'm going to launch my production order for this specific item that I checked my on-hand quantity. And I know if I now go through all the steps, if I do the report as finished, my on-hand quantity for this specific part should actually be augmented with the quantity good that I have been giving in the report as finished. And that's what I'm going to validate. I'm just going to validate that my on-hand quantity has increased with the report as good on the production order. And basically, if this last test is failing, then typically I know something went wrong in here, and I also know that this scenario is not valid any longer. Okay, so now we have been defining a kind of structure. Of course, I need to make sure that I have a place now where I can put all this information as test manager. So I'm going to do that by looking into my BPM library. So yesterday we created on our LCS project an BPM library that we called RSAT Tech Talk. And as you can see, I have actually just been creating all those processes. So I've split up my BPM here according to the different roles that are involved. So for the product planning, I have been creating a task which I called create production order. For the manufacturing, they get one simple task here that's finish the production order. I do realize that in a real scenario, we would have been splitting in starting the production order, then doing all kinds of adding information to the production order, such as the materials used, then the jobs that have been executed, and so on. And then at the end, we would be finishing the production order. Just for simplicity and for the demo, I have all added that together and made it into one finish order. The last step that I added is the warehousing. So we will do some checks on hand. So I defined 2 processes for that. So one is get on hand quantity, and one is validate on hand. And the idea actually is that the test manager would have been set up such a structure according to the way this customer has been defining his processes, and definitely make it sure that for the people who are going to do the recordings afterwards, that they can easily find their way. It's quite simple. If we need to add processes, I can add processes here as a sibling, and I could, for instance, define a process for my sales department. Let's just call it P04. Sales. And if I say 4, then we should type 4 as well. And then I could make some define the processes which are beneath it just by adding a child, and just call this, for instance, T0401. And we will need a process for create a customer for definitely. And probably we will have they're also needing a task recording for creating a sales order. And as you can see, it is quite easy for creating a structure which is representing all kinds of tasks that needs to be recorded. The way how we are setting this up can be similar to the one that you have been defining when you were creating your help system and your task guides for the online help. If you say, no, there is too much difference between what I'm doing for the task guides and what I'm going to use for Regression Suite automation tool, you could decide, as I have been doing here, just to create a dedicated BPM for my Regression Suite tests. But the whole idea is just make sure you have a structure that the people who are doing the recording can easily find their way in and know exactly what they're going to do. One of the important steps that I have been doing during the setup is I made sure that I have the VSTS synchronization. So what will happen every time I'm creating a new task is we will be seeing that there are work items created. And basically what I can do now for each of those work items, I am expecting somebody to do a recording. So basically I could use, this is a link into my Azure DevOps, and I could really use the possibilities of Azure DevOps and making sure that I can, for instance, assign this task that needs to be done to the user who will be doing the recording. And of course, I would give them some information of what I'm expecting from a test case. So important is to make sure that he knows what kind of input parameters he gets for starting, and also explaining what kind of output parameters you expect to be in the recording. If you remember, I'm going to pass the item ID from my on-hand check to my production order. So input parameter for my create production order will be the item ID. And the output parameter is I need to pass the newly created production order to the second recording. So that would be then my output parameter for the create production order. Okay. That's the first step. First step is we have been now defining the scenario. We have been defining all the recordings that needs to be done. So let's now go into step 2 and look a little bit to the next phase is the recording of the test cases. So we're going to do that just by starting up the task recorder in Dynamics 364 Finance and Operations. As indicated earlier, we can define whatever environment. So it doesn't need to be the same environment as the one that we're going to use for doing the playback. But the important is, of course, it needs to have the same version and it needs to have the same parameter setup, and it should have at least the data that we're using must be available in both environments. Typically, who will be doing the recording? That's functional architects, key users, and typically that should start happening when we are doing our user acceptance testing. So as I mentioned, it is necessary that we do have a setup. So we need to have already a setup. Typically, we also need to have some migrated data. So all those things should be ready once we're starting user acceptance tests. And why we are doing that? We need, of course, all those building blocks for then assembling our test scenario. Just going to go quickly into the Dynamics, the task recorder, and highlight. I'm not going to do all the recordings, but I'm just going to do some highlights. So as I'm saying, one of the most important ones is we need to make sure that we utilize our recordings, our input parameters, and we need to utilize, make sure that we have the output parameters. So let's look now for the first recording. I'm going to take the create production order as example. Task recorder. I'm just going to start the task recorder, create the recording, and I'm going to name it accordingly to what my test manager has been defining. So I am responsible for creating the first one, T0101, create production order. I'm going to start that. So the first step would be that in create production order is that I would have to go into the production control all production orders. and I would click on the new production order. And of course, here I'm going to type in the item number that I'm supposed to use. At this moment, the one that I have been setting up is this one. And I'm just typing it in. Okay, the next parameter is the one for the site. The warehouse I need to specify, let's take 11. So this is typically all kind of information that my functional guys would know what kind of information is necessarily to type in here for making sure that we have a good recording. I'm doing here the bare minimum, just specifying the mandatory fields, but you need, of course, to realize that typically a functional guy or the key user will know exactly what kind of details have to be filled in here for making sure that we get a real life example. Important now is that I should not forget to make sure that I have my output parameters. And as output parameters, I wanted to have this production order number, which is generated. And therefore, I'm going to use a feature from the task recorder. So I have here, if I right click on the field, task recorder copy. And basically, this will make sure that I get a variable name in my task recording later on in my test case, which will always have the value of the newly created production order number. And I wanted to make sure that I knew the quantity because I want to use that later in my validation. I could, of course, always test with a fixed number, but if I want to make a parameter out of that as well, I just would do task recorder copy as well. And now I have the two output parameters that I want to have. It is important to make sure that we have this number recorded on the screen. As soon as I press on the create button, this number will never be available any longer, and I would not be knowing it. So the place where we are copying the values is really important to have that as soon as they become available. I'm going to continue my test. So typically, I think I would, in a real life scenario, we would split the recordings in a create production order, and then it would be different tasks for doing the scheduling and for doing the estimations and so on. But I'm just going to continue in the same recording. But important now is I cannot assume that my newly created production order is the last one. I really need to filter on it, because if I'm thinking about a multi-user scenario, and then in parallel, other people could be creating production orders as well, the one which is highlighted is the last created one and is not necessarily the one that I'm creating. So for making sure that I have a very robust recording, I now have to do in a first step doing the filtering. 466, if I remember correctly. No, 446. Right. If I make a mistake, that's not too bad. I can just delete this step and just going to delete it. And my first attempt is wrong, and I can still continue. So my next thing that I'm going to do, now that I'm sure that there is only one order left over, I can now easily do the next of my recordings. As I said, that would be the estimate. And the last step would be the release. Okay, and we're done. So I can stop my task recording, and I can just save it to my Lifecycle services. This will connect me my dynamics into my BPM libraries, and there I will be selecting the right position in my BPM for safeguarding my task recording. My library is the Regression Suite TT one, and there we will be seeing the same structure. The one for production planning is here. I would then just override my create production order. In some cases, this will not work, and that's primarily due to the fact that we can only support users who are in the same tenant. So if you're working with a partner account which is in a different tenant, then that would not work. As an alternative, we can just save it locally to the PC. That will generate an AXDR file. I'm going to put it here, and we could just save it. And then later on, we will be able to upload it to the BPM by just going back here to the production order, create order, and I can use the upload button, which will upload it. And you could just see that says from the preparation, you could just upload it from here. That is if the save directly from Dynamics is in some cases is not working. Okay, so the next step that I need to do is my second recording. So my second recording, of course, I need to make sure. Important one is that my second recording is always starting from a fixed point. So I must make sure that I'm always going to my begin screen, because in the replay, I cannot assume that my system is in a specific state. So I need always to start from a well-known system state, and that's the one that you have the moment just after login. So I'm going to start my second recording, task recording, create recording. That would be then my T0201, finish production order. And this recording, of course, will start with as input parameter the number sequence that was used during the first recording. So in this recording, I first have to go to the all production orders, and I need to start with a filter to make sure that I get my right production order 446. Okay, now I see that this is the production order. I could verify my status, of course, should be released, and I'm just going to start the production order. Quantity is the one that I have been creating, is the one. And next step in this would be, typically here we would have some time where we're waiting for making sure that there is some time reporting on the production order. But for the demo, let's just report as finished. Going to take the default parameter, the ones that were started, and we're done with that. Would stop it, save it, and upload it. So this is basically the important things of the features of making sure that we can copy information from one recording to another recording. So it's the chaining of tests or passing parameters between the different test cases. Another important feature that I want to highlight for the task recording is if we are going to validate, the trick that we're going to do for that is just going to make the T0302, it was called, validate on-hand quantity. Let's start this one. I made already my first mistake. I'm starting not from the right position, so really need to stop this one, will never work. Go back to the main menu and make sure before starting my recording that I'm on my start screen. Create recording, do it again, and correct this one. T0302, validate on-hand quantity, start, and in this I'm just going to go to my product information management, released products, filter on my field, make sure that I have only one record left over, so that I'm absolutely sure in the replay that it will take the correct one. Don't assume that it will be the first one. In a multi-user scenario, you are not sure that it will not be another one. It might be one which is starting with something which is ahead of you. So always make sure that you have something which is unique. And then I'm going to check my on-hand inventory, and I want to know what is my physical inventory. And therefore, here I want to validate it. So I'm going to do task recording validate current value. And note that I have now validate the value for physically inventory is, and it shows me the value. But of course, once we are rerunning the test scenario, it will always have the value, which is in this physically inventory field. Okay, that's it about the second step about recording the test cases. So let's move now to the next step. So typically my functional people or the key users would now be reporting in the work item in Azure DevOps that this task has been finished, and they would reassign it to the test manager so that he can do the third step, which is the prepare test scenario. All right, so typically what we're going to do now is we have all the recordings. So we're going to group those together in our Azure DevOps, and we're going to bring them together in one test suite. Again, who is doing that would be the same person who has been defining the test scenario, the solution architect, the test manager. And of course, we can only do that once we have all the recordings have been captured by our key persons. And when they have finished, they will inform us about it, and that's the moment we can start it. So the outcome should be of this step is that we validate that our scenario is consistent, as I was indicating, the two primarily things we're trying to achieve is making sure that it is can be played repetitively and that we can predict the outcome upfront. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We're going to go into our Azure DevOps. And I'm going to go to my test plan that I have been creating in the session from yesterday. So I created a test plan and I created a test suite. So we can have for every combination of test cases, so all the test cases together are forming a test scenario. What I would recommend here is that for each of those things that you want to run together, you would create a new static suite. So you could just add one for test scenario 1, and then another one for test scenario 2. I'm going to use my demo for the moment, and I'm just going to add my recordings, and I'm going to use the add existing. Add existing, basically, I have been adding already in the query, and I know that all my test scenarios will have in the title, they will have the name of the BPM library, which was called RSAT TT from Tech Talk. So if I just running and I'm just running that query, I will only see my test cases, which are belonging to my test suite. And typically what I would do is I would add all those to my test case, to my test suite. And then, of course, I need to execute them into the right order. So the first thing that I would do, if you remember the scenario, is doing an inquiry on the on-hand quantity. Afterwards, I'm going to create the production order. So I need to order this one, and I need to put it in second place. Then the next step is I'm going to finish the production order. And the last one is I'm going to validate the on-hand quantity. So this is what we're calling the preparation of your test cases into the test suite. Of course, this only has to be done once. So once it's ready, afterwards, I'm just going to run it every time, all the scenarios, all the test cases, one after the other. All right. This is preparation. The last step is that we're going to validate it. And for the validation, I'm going to use the Regression Suite automation tool. Regression Suite automation tool, the first step that I'm going to do is I'm going to load my test cases, and I will be seeing I've somewhere forgot to save something. Load again. Demo test plans. Demo has 4. Yeah, that's correct. So if I'm loading, demo, I need to click on demo, of course, and not on test scenario 1. Apologies for this mistake. So as you can see now, I have exactly the same situation. So I have the 4 test cases: get on hand quantity, validate on hand quantity, create production order, finish my order. This is not correct, my order. I still need the validate, should be on the last one. Create and finish, okay. And don't forget to press the done. That's what I forgot previous time, and that's the reason why it was not saved. Okay, let's go back into load again. Going to load it, and I should have now get on hand, create production order, finish production order, validate, exactly as I'm expecting to have. Next step that I need to do is after I have my test cases, I need to create artifacts for them. So I'm just going to click here for all of them, and I'm going to create new, generate test execution and parameter files. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm getting an XML file from the recording. On the test machine, we're going to make a C# file out of that, and from the C# file, we're going to compile it, and we're going to having a DLL file that we can execute then after them. What I have been doing when I was reading the recording does have the data and also have the steps. And it has been splitting that. In one step, I have my C# file, and on the other hand, I have my XLS file, which is called the parameter file. Parameter file, I can now just verify, and I can make the necessary modifications. So remember that I said that I want to have the output parameters from the first recording as input parameter from the second recording. That's what I'm going to do here in my Excel files. So let's look to the first Excel file. What we're going to see in the parameter file, if I'm pressing on the edit, it will spin off my Excel file. And the general tab will give me some information. So I will see the test case, the recording name, the playback order we should ignore. We also see that we were going to play back it in the company USMF. So this is the same company that was set up as my default. But if I want to run this test scenario in another company, I can just change it over here and type in DEMF, and then it would be running into the company DEMF instead. Of course, if we are doing that, we have to be very careful with it, because we need to make sure that all the setup of those companies is similar, because we really want to make sure that all the forms will be popping up exactly the same and will contain the same information. As soon as we're making modifications to that, it might be already making a big impact. For instance, if I start a production order with an item, and that item is FIFO, it will always I will always be able to start the production order. But if I choose an item which is standard cost, then I can only start the production order if I have defined a standard cost. So if I launch a production order which doesn't have a standard cost, then typically a new form will pop up to tell me that it's impossible for launching that production order. And that's the reason why, although it is very easy for trying to run a test scenario which is running in one company into another company, we still have to verify that our parameter setup is making sure that we will get the same forms and same controls that we can utilize. If I don't want to run it at this, initially everything will be running as an administrator, but if I now want to run it with a user with a specific role, I can just type in the alias of that person. So I could, for instance, just type in my alias, and then it would not be running as administrator, but it would be running with this user ID, with the roles of this user ID. I mentioned that we sometimes need to wait a time before something has happened for the batch jobs, for instance. So this is the place where we can put seconds, the number of seconds. So if I want to wait for 5 minutes, I need to put in a pause for 300 seconds here. So that will make sure that if I'm running the suite before starting this scenario, we will be waiting 5 minutes before we start running this. I can also specify how long this test should take. If it takes more than that amount of seconds, the test will be aborted. But the most important one is that we have now here the definition of my variables. So I wanted to have a variable for the item name. This is my invent on-hand item name alias variable. And I needed to have a variable for the on-hand quantity. So this is the variable will be called physical invent. So typically the name will be unique. So and is composed of the form, then the control name, and the task, the test case ID, and it ends with copy. This is how we are recognizing the output parameters, and they will be unique per test case because we have the test ID in it. So if I want to use a different item ID from the invent table, I can be doing that if it is in a different test case, because it will generate two different parameters then. If I'm going to look into my other fields, so I have message validation. Message validation is something that I can be using. So if I have a scenario and I want to verify that specific info or warning messages has been popped up, I can just take a copy of that info message and put it in here. And then we will, when we are replaying the test, we will verify that that message has been popped up in the info log when we were doing the replay of the test scenario. And the last one is when I was doing the filtering, I filtered on an item number from the recording. As you can see, this is still an old one and from an older recording. So I'm just going to put in the item number. So if I just want something new, I can just place in here another variable, and then it will be used in the rest of the scenarios. So this is the item number is coming from my filter that I was using when I was going on the released products. Of course, if I change the parameter here and I want to use the new value in the next scenario, that's the reason why I put it also in an output variable. So I will have the name actually will be passed to my next scenario via this output variable. Okay, that's for the first one. Let's look for the second one. So create my production order. I want to create my production order and I want to use the item number that was defined in my first scenario. So what I'm going to look for then is in my product table create. I'm seeing here my item number. It is of course still the value as it was when I started the recording. And now I'm going to change it with the output variable of my first recording. So if you remember, that was the name alias copy variable. So I'm just going to paste in, replace the value by the variable name. And I'm going to do that exactly the same for the name, which should be the same one, and just save it. From the create production order, I should have got a production ID, and I'm going to find that output variable name. So I see here that I have my production ID as output variable, and this is my output variable for the quantity that I have been using for my production order. So I need to remember those two parameters, and I'm going to use that in my next recording. So the product ID, I will need that at the moment that I'm doing, I want to finish my production order. So if I'm going to look into the third one, finish production order, remember that that scenario started with just going onto a filter on a production order. During the recording, I was using the value 446. I was doing the demonstration. When I did this recording, it was 442. And I'm going to override it with the output parameter here. So I'm just going to copy that variable and replace the value by the variable name. And that's how I'm chaining my test cases to each other. Last step in this whole scenario is looking into the validation. And for the validation, I'm just going to look into the last scenario, looking into, and as you might remember, we do a filter. So of course, I must make sure that I'm filtering on the right item. That's the chaining. Just going to copy that from the other one. All right. And then in the invent hand item, invent on hand item tab, I see now that I have 3 columns. Typically, if you just install your regression suite out of without making any modifications, you would only have 2 columns. You would have the field name and you would have the value, and we would always doing the validation if it's equal to that value. If you want to have an operator so that you could do comparisons like smaller than, smaller equal than, greater than, we need to make a modification to the setup file, and therefore we're going to go into the configuration file. Configuration file, we will be finding that in the directory where we have been installing our regression suite automation tool. By default, that would be on my C drive. C would be in the program files x86, would be under regression suite automation tool. And then we will find here a config file. If I'm just search for config files, we will have a file which is called Microsoft Dynamics Regression Suite Windows app.exe.config file. That's the file where we need to make a modification. And I need to find here some of the keys. And one of the keys is called add operator fields to Excel validation. By default, this will be on false. What you need to do is you need to change the value in true. And after that change, you need to restart your regression suite automation tool. And then next time you will be generating the test execution and parameter files. That's the moment where you will get the possibility for getting the multiple operators. Basically, what we're going to do here as operator, I'm going to make a formula now. And for the formula, I'm going to say it should basically be my variable, what was my on-hand physical before I started the scenario. And I need to add the report as finished quantity. So this is my quantity schedule to it. So I'm just going to put a formula instead of a value here. And I'm just doing that by adding, by just important is that I'm not add additional things, but this is my physical invent variable, and I'm going to add my quantity scheduled to it, and that should be, that is my expected validation. If I'm saving that and all the other files, then I'm ready to run. So now we have been having all the files, the preparation done. So typically the next step would be that I would be running my test suite. I would just be selecting here the all, and I would be clicking on my run. I'm not going to start that. That would definitely take us for another 10 minutes for running it. But basically, that's all what I have to do. Now, once that I have been verifying everything, what I would be doing then is basically I'm going to safeguard all the changes that I have been doing to my Excel file. So I should not forget to upload the changes. And if I have uploaded them, they will all be stored now in my Azure DevOps. And the next time that I would be doing the load, I would basically getting the copies from which were stored in my Azure DevOps so that I don't have to redo all the modifications to the Excel files that I have been doing here now for the first time. And then after that, we can just execute it over and over. And that basically would then be the last step. The last step is that we would execute the test scenarios. And basically, we can be running that either interactively, could be done via the graphical user interface, just by clicking the run. But of course, if we have to run that regularly, we typically would schedule that. So we could easily use a scheduling tool for just calling the playback of the suite. The reason why we can do that is because we do have a command line, and we can actually run everything from the command line. When would we be doing that? Well, typically we would do it every time we make big changes to the configuration, we're making changes to the data, or of course, if we get newer versions from the application. Might be a newer version from Microsoft, might be a newer version from any of your ISVs, or it could, of course, also be one of your customizations that has been changed. And why, of course, we just want to verify that the modifications that we have been doing have not been introducing blocking issues. Let's have a last word regarding the command line. So the command line, for the command line, I just need to run a command. Don't forget that we need to run it as an administrator. So I'm just opening a command prompt. I'm going to go to the place where I have been installing my regression suite automation tool, and then I can run there the console application. And I'm going just show you the question mark. So that will show me all the commands that I have. So for instance, I could see a list would just give me a list of all my test cases. I can ask the test cases from a specific suite. So let's try that one. Just list test suite. And my test suite was called demo. And if I'm lucky, I should get my get on hand quantity. I will get my create production order. I will get my finish production order. I will do my validate on hand. And of course, if I'm running it from command line, typically the command that I would be using is doing the playback suite. Playback suite, and then give the name. And basically that would trigger the execution of first scenario get on hand, second create production order, then finish production order, and then validate on hand quantity. Important to know is after that has been run, then we would validate the results. Of course, I would not be sitting in front of my screen watching all those scenarios running. If I have to run that regularly, the outcome of a test suite will be written into my Azure DevOps. So let's move to the Azure DevOps again, and I would find it under my test plan runs. Just going to see all the ones that I have been running. Going to select this one because that's one which was not complete correctly. So this is my demo where I had the 4 scenarios, but one has been failing. That was deliberately, otherwise I would have nothing to show here. So if I'm looking into my test results, I would then see which scenario has been failing. So it was my validated on hand quantity that was failing, and I could just click on this one and making sure that I see what's going wrong. and basically it says me that at that moment it failed, and typically it failed. I do remember why this was failing. I could also validate it by looking into the screenshot that was been taken. Just let's save that and then look up to it. I can see that it was taking the wrong number. So I have a screenshot of while it was failing, and that's the reason why it didn't work at that moment. But as you can see, you get an error message, you get a stacked phrase, and you get information of why things were failing. Okay, I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. I just want to hand over to Archana and see if there are some questions that are that we want to raise to the whole audience.
Thanks, Mark. So there's a follow-up question from yesterday's session. So there was mention of a command line through command line script. We can also make sure the test execution is a part of the Azure DevOps build pipeline. So the question is, only through release pipeline, we deploy the package to tier 2 environment, but before deploying our code, how can we make it execute as part of build pipeline? Because if we can execute it only in my tier 1 build environment, which obviously will fail as I don't have admin access to tier 1. So I don't know if you got the gist of the question. So I think essentially the ask is to be able to trigger our through build.
So the answer to the question is what we need to do for being able to call it from the test from the build is that we would not run the RSet on the build server, but we would still run the RSet on the test machine. And basically on the test machine, you need to install the Azure build client, and that would allow the build server to connect to the test machine and executing the tests against the machine that you have been selecting. So you could easily there there is in the command line, there is an option for having the settings files. So with the use of the settings files, so with the /settings and then here the settings file, I can just make sure that my regression suite automation tool will be connecting to the right environment. So this is one of the things we were discussing yesterday in the session about the setup. So I can have multiple settings files. So for each environment, I can have a different settings file. And then from the command line, I can force the regression suite, the console, to use the right machine. So that's how you would integrate it into your build strategy.
Thanks, Mark. Is there a version control for the test in the future, or how is it thought that you have different versions of an RSAT test?
That's a very good question. At this moment, we don't have version control. It's on our wish list. Going to be very honest with it. Of course, at this moment, the top priority is making sure that whatever tests you are creating, we can be doing a consistent replay. So bug fixing at this moment is the highest priority, definitely in scenarios where we are seeing that customers are depending on things that are not working. And then the next steps that we're working is we know that we do have limitations. What we can replay is everything that can be captured by the task recording. But that excludes, for instance, scenarios where you would be opening a file, because if we're opening a file, we're using a part of the operating system, the file control for selecting the file, and that will not be captured by task recording. Another one is our mobile client applications. We do realize that a lot of our customers are using that. At this moment, we don't have it. It's coming in one of the next versions. And basically, if you want to use it, it is available already in preview. So if you are in the Insider program, you could start using that as well. And another one that is on our pipeline at the moment is making sure that we would be able to capture also the scenarios which are coming from POS, MPOS or CPOS, but at least we need to have a way of capturing that information as well. So the wish list of having version control, yes, we do have it on our wish list, but it's not for near future.
All right. So there are a couple of questions, in fact, 2 or 3 questions. I'm going to just bundle them together regarding negative scenario. Essentially, the ask is that, hey, can we have negative scenarios? And if they are negative and if they fail, which is expected, and you're expecting the test case to pass. Like for one of the example is if I search for a certain value in quick search, and if no records return, then the test case should fail. But in this case, because the task recording is, you are searching for, let's say, a product that does not exist, it is a positive test case pass, but the expectation is they want the test case to fail. So kind of like a negative scenario.
Yes, both questions are on our wish list and are been worked on at the moment. So we want to make sure that you can validate that the list is empty, so you could see that something is not there. So that would be a validation. Then, so if you validate that something is negative and it should not be negative, it will fail. Then the next one is that actually you would, the fail of the test, you would like to see that as a positive. At this moment, we don't have it. It would be just failing here, saying the result is not okay. But you would be expecting that. So you would have to know that it's expected result. And we're also having a work item for seeing if we could have somewhere a possibility that we could have an additional column that you could have a result, an expected result, and that the expected result would then be, if you would have said that it should fail, that you could actually say this test has was correct. But at this moment, no, we have it both as on our to-do list.
Thanks, Mark. So there's also a request for please show us the results of a test case that fails. Did you go through that? Sorry, I was not focusing on the demo.
Yeah, you would just see here the error status. So the test fails, it will be telling you what you have been trying to do, and it will identify why things were not working.
There's a question on... Oh, sorry.
And then you have all the files which were telling me what kind of things have been happening, the steps and so on. So you could just save that locally and then looking into that. But you get a full log of any test case that is failing. If you go to the ones where they're working correctly, you would, of course, don't have all those attachments.
Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to see. Oh, once RSET runs all the test cases and the result is stored in DevOps test plans, can we send automated mails with the test results? I don't have insight into that, Mark, do you? I mean, this is more of a DevOps question.
This is an Azure DevOps question. I know that you can have alerts in Azure DevOps, but basically getting an alert if something's happening, I have no clue.
I think we can follow up on that. We are not aware of it. I'm sure there must be something in DevOps where you should be able to send automated emails, but we'll need to follow up on that.
You need to know that if you schedule it to run, for instance, daily, then every day you would have a result that you have to look into it. I do understand that probably you want only to get a mail if a test run was failing. That definitely will already be quite complicated for setting that up, if at all possible.
All right. There's a question about, are there any plans to release pre-built test suites for RSAT? I'll take that. So we do have conversations ongoing within the different product teams. We do have pre-built test suites for the out-of-box functionalities that we are using internally for testing purposes. And this has been raised as part of our RSET workshops as, hey, does Microsoft have plans to kind of release that externally? So we do have conversations ongoing regarding that. We have not reached a conclusion, mostly because of the fact that even if we release our recordings, that's going to be against our demo data. So which means that you might be able to use that as reference, but there's still a considerable amount of work involved to edit all these Excel parameter files, to update the data to suit that of your environments, your customers' environments, or your own environments, which means we're not quite sure if we're adding value by releasing any of these pre-built test suites. But that is under consideration. We have not reached a conclusion yet on that, but you will definitely be hearing from us about it probably the next half of this year.
You need to take into consideration that if you get a recording from us, which is built for the demo database, of course, you will be able to play it back in your demo database, but it doesn't mean it will be running into your customer. Your setup might be different, as I was indicating already. Depending on your setup, you might have other forms popping up. And modifying recordings typically tends to be more complex than doing new recordings. I think the only value in it would be that you would get some examples from us more as training material than it would be that it would be able to be reused in your own scenarios.
Thanks, Mark. There's a question around, I believe, the WMS mobile app preview, which we had mentioned in our last Tech Talk. I just want to clarify that there is the preview feedback program for RSAT support for WMS mobile app. It is not yet there. We are working on introducing a preview feedback program for that. We don't have a clear ETA, but I'm hoping we should be able to get that introduced by next month. But right now, the preview feedback program is not there yet, but the plan is to get that introduced. We're just going through the formalities right now to get that as part of the Yammer feedback program. Is there any plan to extend the RSAT for external systems integration testing?
So the limitation of task recording is that you can only record the things that are happening within the Dynamics Finance and Operations. So for integrations, typically, if you were thinking about incoming integrations that are coming from an external system, we don't have anything in our roadmap for automating that. But of course, once you have been running the interfaces from externally, the validations that the data has been arriving correctly, that's something that you can do with RSAT. And since you can, we do have the command line, so we could make sure that our validations are run after an external system has been sending that, if you have an external scheduler for doing that. So yes, that's one of the things that that you can do today already. Regarding output messages that we're sending, we do realize that, of course, we want to make sure that every time you get exactly the same message. So your metadata should be the same, as well as the data format should be the same. And we're working on something that we would be able to validate that if you have an output package, that we can compare it with what was generating before, what would be generating now, and making sure that what is sent out is exactly the same. But that's something which is in the pipeline, and we don't have any ETA for that at the moment.
I'm going to take a couple more questions, Mark, and then we should wrap up. So this one is regarding, there are two different variations of the same question. I'm going to put both across. Is it possible to run the same test case with different data groups? That means repeat the same test 20 times with different data in the same execution. There is also a variation of that is they want to run the multiple times the same set of test scenarios, but let's say with different items. You know, the items might have different, let's say, inventory model group or some of the characters associated with that. So one is generic, being able to repeat it with generic data. The other one is with specific data that needs to be input with, let's say, specific different items, not a random item, but specific items.
Yeah. So let's first talk a little bit about randomizing. That's indeed a topic that we didn't touch this time. It is in one of the previous tech talks. You can use the Excel function. So I have been, if I have create production order, I now have been using an output variable. But if I would just want to randomize it, I could just create here, need to see create production order, where I'm using the item ID. So this is where I have been using the input parameters. If I want to randomize, and one of the things that I could do is, probably this is not such a good example. Let's try to see, create product production order. One of the examples that we would be doing is we would, I'm just going to show you how you would be doing it is you can use the functions, the random functions in here, and say for an item number, I'm going to use an Excel function. So I'm going to use a concatenation of AT, and then I'm going to use something which is always generating a new item. So I would generate now, I will be using now function, and I'm going to use now. Okay, that's not really readable, so I can just create a text out of that and then give it a format, year, month, day, hour, minute, for instance. So that's what basically the technique that I'm using if I'm going to create new production orders. I need to be making sure that the production order, that item number doesn't exist. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to use the function now in Excel. And every time that I'm opening the Excel file, I'm sure that I will get a new number. And that's basically what we're doing. Before we start running, we are reading the parameters from Excel. So we're opening the Excel, and that will trigger a newly created number. Another function that you can use is ran between. So then you would be selecting a random number between your start number and your end number. So that's how you can be randomizing into the Regression Suite automation tool itself. The next thing that you could be doing is using the command line. So in our hands-on lab, we have been some examples where we are just using PowerShell scripts for modifying the fields. So PowerShell is just opening the Excel file, is modifying the field. So there you could just select from a list of item numbers and just updating your Excel file, and then you run your regression suite from the command line. And that's, for instance, we do have an example there where we just have been using create customer, and we're just changing every time the customer ID, the street, and his address. And so you can randomly create new customers. And you can do that in a for loop, for instance, for creating 100 customers. That said, yes, it's all possible, but you should not try to use this methodology for doing large data uploads. That is not suited for that. If you really want to do upload of creating random data, then you need to look into the data migration framework and making sure that you have a file created, generated with the data that you need to have, and just uploading it via the data migration framework. I'm hoping that's answered the question.
Thanks, Mark. We are literally 30 minutes past meeting time. Thank you so much, all of you, for attending the Tech Talk. Janice, over to you.
Thanks, Archana. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a brief moment here and bring your attention to a link that I posted in the Q&A panel. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference. We ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference, have feedback on how we can provide you with a better event, or you'd like to submit topics for future web conferences, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. And that is going to conclude today's web conference. Attendees can access the web conference recording via the same registration link that was used to attend today's live broadcast. Please allow 72 hours for that recording to become available. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters, Mark and Archana, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.